All right, welcome back to Ecclesiastes chapter 9. Verse 1, I'm going back. Last week we covered the first couple of verses, but indeed I took all this to heart and explained it all. The righteous, the wise, and their works are in God's hands. People don't know whether to expect love or hate. Everything lies ahead of them. So what promises were given to you at your birth by your parents, your family, or your world? And I mean literally the moment that you were conceived. What promises were made? Or we could go forward roughly 9 months later when you were born. What promises were made? And there were a lot of people that made those promises, standing over the baby saying, I promise you, or I will do my best to. And what Solomon is saying is that everybody comes into the world, but nobody fully understands what's going to happen because everything is still in front of them. All they have is the history of certain people's lives, certain books, certain songs, certain poetry that has guided them. Today, of course, we have TV and social media, but none of us really know what we can fully expect. What expectations did you have at your birth? And the answer is, of course, you just wanted to eat, sleep, and poop. But what about when you were 16, 18, 21, and 35, or older than that? What expectations did you start to both establish for yourself, and what other expectations were established by others who came to you and said, you're 30 years old. You're 40. You should be, hey, by the time and we work through this. And this is what Solomon is trying to get to. The understanding that expectations, both ours and the world's, have a completely different thought process. Verse 2, everything is the same for everyone. There is one fate for the righteous and the wicked, for the good and the bad, for the clean and the unclean, for the one who sacrifices and the one who does not. And as I mentioned last week, what we're really talking about, we're not talking about heaven. We're not talking about there only being one place where everybody goes when they die, but rather we're talking about the fact that everyone in this life is under the same earth and universe that's coming apart at the seams. So the purpose of the church and the end result, what we're working for is not to change the end. The end is already established. What we're working toward, and we're going to get to it a little bit further on, which in a much deeper way, but our job is to say there are two options when you leave this planet, and only two. And as a result, we would like you to join us in this option. Now, we're going to talk about it, like I said, in a little bit, but I want you to think about the fact that when you talk to somebody who believes in evolution, and I mean only evolution, not a Christian who, but I'm talking about somebody who just says there is no God, there is nothing. And you say, okay, what is your end going to be like? 25, 28 years ago, I got a phone call from one of our members who was a brand new Christian. Her father-in-law was dying. He had been a lifelong Buddhist along with his entire family. He was in his last days on this earth. He called the Buddhist priest in and basically asked him a blunt question, what happens when I die? And the Buddhist priest said, well, there are all sorts of options. And he goes, do any of them lead to me going to a heaven? And the Buddhist priest says, not really. He then called his daughter-in-law, who had been talking to him about Jesus for the last several years while she went through confirmation class. And he said, get that pastor over here. I want to talk to him. So I was able to go out, talk to him. We baptized him. Just a few days after we baptized him, he died. What he was looking for, his whole life suddenly changed when the doctor says, you're in your last days. And he's like, I don't want my life to end. And this thing that I have given my life to doesn't help me understand or can't make promises about what's next. But my daughter-in-law says that Jesus can. That's what Solomon is getting to. He's saying, wherever you are in your life, whatever you've been going through, what are your expectations? Because this becomes important. When the church says you are saved by grace through faith, and this is not your work, underline, hyphenate, the whole bit, not, so that it stands out, not your work, it's the gift of God. It changes how you view the church, heaven, eternal life, God, and everything else. Verse 3. This is an evil in all that is done under the sun. There is one fate for everyone. In addition, the hearts of people are full of evil, and madness is in their hearts while they live. After that, they go to the dead. There is one fate, and that is death. With the exception of a few people, like Elijah and a few others that it sounds like God may have taken them. So in what way does this level the playing field in life? Do you really think that famous people understand this? Because if life is about he who dies with the most toys still dies, but at least he gets to say, I gathered the most toys, is that enough when you die? And by the way, it would be if we cease to exist. If at the end there is nothing beyond this world, nothing beyond this life, then sure, taking my last breath, if I were able to say, yeah, I was king over my kingdom, that probably would be enough. But if this life goes on and there is something beyond this life, verse 4, there is hope for whoever is joined with all the living, since a live dog is better than a dead lion. Now, this is one of those moments where we back up and we go, why did you bring in a live dog is better than a dead lion? And we have to understand that this is one of those things in Hebrew, like, all the things that we say that especially when somebody comes from another country and they might understand English, but they really struggle with all these little things that we say to each other, and so there it is. It's an ancient proverb. If you can fix one thing, even if it's just a stray dog, you've made a difference. Because if you find a live dog and you're able to feed it and you're able to get it adopted, you've made a difference. Now, that live dog is not nearly as quote unquote important as the king of beasts, the lion. But if the lion is dead, then it doesn't matter what you do because all you've got is a dead lion. So what Solomon is trying to remind us or point us to is that as we look at our life, as we look at the result of our life, would we rather have a dead lion or would we rather have a live puppy? Verse 5, for the living know that they will die, but the dead don't know anything. There is no longer a reward for them because the memory of them is forgotten. Now, this is where he literally continues to hammer the theme over and over again. While I'm alive, I know that I'm going to die. That should change the way that I live. It should change the way that I view my life and living. He says, the dead don't know anything. And he says, as a result, he says, they can no longer make any choices. This takes us, of course, to the parable, or I actually believe it's a story of Lazarus and the rich man. I think it's a story because nowhere else did Jesus give names to the characters in this parable. But here, there's Lazarus and the rich man. It says, Lazarus doesn't have a dime. He sits and the dogs lick his sores and he has nothing. And yet there's this rich guy who, everything is catered for him. Everything is taken care of him. And all of a sudden, they both die. And the poor man goes to be with Abraham in heaven. Not because he's poor, but because he trusted in the Lord. The rich man goes to hell. And the rich man is sitting in hell, and he looks up, and he can see Lazarus in the bosom of Abraham. That's another one of those metaphors for heaven. And he calls out, and he says, hey, send him down here to dip his finger in the water and cool my tongue. In other words, the rich man realizes he can't get out of hell, but he says, at least, he was my servant in life. Let him come down and continue to serve me and make my life in hell more comfortable. And Abraham says, sorry, they can't cross over to you, and you can't cross over to us. And when we have this, we come to this realization, because nowhere does it say that Lazarus can look down and see the punishment that the rich man is getting, but the rich man can look up and see what Lazarus has going for him. And this is where we start saying, how quickly things change because there is one fate, and yet what happens after that fate determines whether your life was lived worthwhile or not. All right, we're getting theological. The living believers know they will die but still live. The dead who think they are living don't understand. This is why when we get baptized, we die and then we're resurrected. But in truth, what we're dying to is our sins. Because we're already dead, as St. Paul would say, in the trespasses of our sins. In the eyes of God, we're dead. We're not alive. Doesn't matter how much we think we're alive, doesn't matter how many things we get done. In our eyes, we might think we're still living, but we're dead. If you ever get a chance and you have probably about a week, because it's going to take that long because you're going to keep rereading, pick up C.S. Lewis's book, The Great Divorce. Now, first of all, it's not about divorce. It's about heaven and hell. It is about an individual and their life, and he's trying to figure out what's going on with God and his life and all this. And it's a bus trip, by the way, to hell. But the way that C.S. Lewis portrays it is you find yourself saying, yes, that's the truth. And then you get a little further down the road in this bus and you realize that it really wasn't the truth at all. Because how we perceive both life and death and heaven and hell is very different than the realities of life and death and heaven and hell. And so what Solomon is saying is that we need to back up and understand that those of us who believe in Jesus, we know that our life is lived for the sake of our Savior, and when we die, we keep living. This life is already written in a book. The dead think that they have total control over their life. Now, this is where I said we were going to get a little bit deeper into theology. I'm one of those individuals that when I discover somebody who is anti-God or anti-church, rather than hit them over the head with a King James Bible that weighs 50 pounds or scream and yell at them and tell them how terrible they are, I do my best to be polite to them insofar as they will allow me to. In the New Testament, insofar as it has to do with you, be at peace with everyone. There are individuals who I really believe are never going to change their heart or their soul. They are focused on this life and doing what they're going to do. They do not want God. They don't want Jesus. They don't want religion. They don't want faith. They don't want any of the things that we wrap around this Jesus thing. They are in charge of the world. And when they die, they go to hell. And remember, you don't go to hell because you were bad. You go to hell because you did not embrace the gift of God. But when they die, they're going to spend eternity in hell. And I don't think it's my job to make this life a living hell for them, unless it's going to change how they feel about Jesus and heaven. And so when somebody starts mouthing off against the church and about God, George Carlin, all those individuals, instead of getting angry and going on social media and ranting about how evil and terrible they are, sometimes it's just best to say, I understand you're hurting. I understand you're trying to figure out this life thing. Let me know if I can make a difference. Let me know if I'm not going to hammer you. You ever want to talk about Jesus? I'm happy to talk to Jesus about you. But in the meantime, I'll be happy to talk about football or baseball or whatever. Because if this life is the only heaven and the closest thing you're ever going to get to heaven, my job is not to make you even worse than you are. Verse 6, their love, their hate, and their envy have already disappeared, and there is no longer a portion for them in all that is done under the sun. I want you to think about this. The greatest minds who were not believers, who didn't care about the church, didn't care about God, everything they left behind, even though they're some of the best read books, even though they're best listened to music. In other words, these are things that they truly made a difference in the world. And yet, because they are not with God, everything is simply washed away, because when the heavens and the earth are destroyed, everything that they did is destroyed. See, when we get to heaven, we don't have all those things that we stored up. I've started going through my closets and my books. I've culled probably a couple hundred books out of my collection. I still have probably another 400 or 500. But I've culled a couple of hundred books, gave them away to anybody who wanted them, because when I retire from the ministry, there's like a dozen books in the Bible that I need. And so I've started to think about that. Because whereas those things were very, very important to me, because when I became a pastor, I thought the more books you had on your shelves, the smarter you looked, even if you never read them. And now I'm beginning to realize that most of those books, by the way, I found a whole bunch of books which were really, really good about understanding ministry and life in the 80s. That was now 40 years ago. And so all those words, all of those books that were not only in the top 10 in the church's sphere, but a lot of these books were actually in the top 10, period, that everybody was buying. Nobody even knows who the authors are anymore. Nobody even remembers the books except those of us who are old. And this is where, when Solomon says, all this stuff disappears, we have to understand that everything we do in our life, the only thing we get to keep are the relationships we made and the people that we were able to share Jesus with. For those who are lost, only God knows who they are. They are already forgotten along with everything they've done. This is the ultimate encouragement for the believer, because we make the difference in the lives of the people around us. It's sometimes the simplest ways. But sometimes we can make a difference, because that's the only thing we get to take with us into heaven. Nothing else. Verse 7, go eat your bread with pleasure and drink your wine with a cheerful heart, for God has already accepted your works. Now this is interesting, because this can go either way. God accepted your works, in other words, and he's cast them off, or God has accepted your works and he gave thanks because he was the one who was doing the work through you. Isaiah 4:1, we will eat our own bread. 2 Thessalonians, let them eat their own bread. Either God has accepted us or he hasn't. If he has, we've got it made. If he hasn't, then there's no hope for us. And this is where, when we talk about eating your bread, has anybody ever in here made bread and put too much salt in it, or too much yeast, or not enough yeast? I've got a famous story that back in California, I made peanut butter cookies one time, and guess what I forgot to put in? The peanut butter. And by the way, they're not even good sugar cookies. I mean, they're terrible. And it's one of those things that when we make our bread, the bread of life, this is what Solomon's talking about. He's not talking about physical bread. He's talking about the bread of life, our life. And he says, when you are fixing your bread and you put in a bunch of this and a bunch of this and a bunch of this, that's how Solomon views our life, where we spend our time, where we spend our money, the things that we value. And he says, so when we are eating our bread, he says, we are literally enjoying the fruits of our faith or the fruits of our unbelief. Both lead to very different places. Verse 8, let your clothes be white all the time, and never let oil be lacking on your head. Now, the reason that this becomes important is because this is one of those verses, by the way, that he's saying that there are ways that we as believers can help the world know that we're believers, but also ways that we can help others know that we're believers. So right now at the Fort Wayne Seminary, there's a big thing going on that the students that are there, many of them are asking their wives to cover their heads. Now, this goes back to the Old Testament and the New Testament, and there's been all sorts of things said about it going back and forth. You've got the Quakers and the Shakers, and you've got all of these individuals, and there's, it says a woman should literally cover herself in the presence of God. And I guarantee that we could, if we pulled up on Google or Siri right now, we could get 100 different explanations for that. Some just say, oh, it means, long hair, because there's a very specific place that says a woman's glory is her long hair. And by the way, the temple prostitutes often had very short hair. That's how you knew who they were, so that you didn't embarrass yourself asking someone who, was the high priest's wife. And so you read these stories and you find this out. But when he says, let your clothes be white all the time, you see, Solomon is speaking about customs and traditions. Romans and Greeks favor a purple garment, riches and royalty. In other words, if I wear bright colors such as purple, everybody looks and says, ooh, they must be wealthy. Kind of like today, People wear a Rolex watch, or, they've got the brand new iPhone, and people go, ooh, they have money, or they drive a Ferrari or a Maserati. Solomon says, wear white. The Jews favor a white garment. It is symbolic of all their washings and the cleanliness, signifying who they are. And so Solomon says, you want to know who you are. It's not just, he says, when you're wearing these garments, wear them like you mean it. Understand that you have been washed, and as we would say in the New Testament, in the blood of the Lamb, because in the Old Testament, they also were washed in the blood of the sacrifices, which purified them. And so he says, you can go around wearing purple or red or green or any of these bright colors. You can be like all these people. But the truth of the matter is, he says, what we have set apart and your righteousness, which is not yours, it is God's, it can be displayed by the way that you dress. Verse 9, enjoy life with the wife you love all the days of your fleeting life, which has been given to you under the sun, all your fleeting days, for that is your portion in life and in your struggle under the sun. All right, let's go back to the previous chapter where he kept talking about that woman who was so evil and that woman, okay? And note that Solomon would have had to have chosen which wife, because he had 300 wives, 600 concubines. And so when we look at this, we can either deep dive into saying, okay, Solomon, then who is this woman that you were so angry at, a chapter ago that you said had never told the truth and was always evil? And if you say, enjoy your life with the wife you love, which one of your 300 do you love the most? And we have to back away from that and realize that he's being symbolic. Solomon is writing to the common man, the blue-collar worker, what we would call. And when we ask why, it's actually pretty simple. Solomon's wisdom, even though all the rich and the famous came and sat at his feet and brought him gold and other riches, just making him, and it's interesting, when you already have more money than everybody else, why do you need more? But they do. And they brought it, they said, allow me to honor you by bringing you gold. And like Sheba brought all this stuff, and just let me hear your wisdom. I just want to sit and soak it in. But the truth of the matter is, Solomon is writing this because he has seen, if you remember, in the previous 8 chapters, the weight that this world puts on the people of God. And he says they've all been wearing this yoke, which is why Jesus later says, come unto me, all ye who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. And so Solomon is saying, look, the world and the church is going to put an awful lot on your shoulders. Some of it they do intentionally, some of it they do unintentionally, some of it you take upon yourself, even though it wasn't meant that way. And he says, if you really are going to enjoy your life, then understand that there is a way to do it. And it's not by either making yourself so busy or so overwhelmed that you destroy the very thing that you're trying to enjoy. In verse 10, whatever your hands find to do, do with all your strength, because there is no work, planning, knowledge, or wisdom in Sheol where you are going. I just think about this for a second. This is the most direct he has been about those who are wasting their life. Again, what's the purpose of evangelism? And who needs the most opportunities to be evangelized? And so he says, look, if you're going to spend your whole life working, slaving away, first of all, if you get to heaven, you're going to enjoy the work that you're given because it's who you were created to be. And so you will never think twice about it. And it's not about the reward. It's not about earning anything. It's not about becoming better than anybody else. In heaven, we serve because we can't not serve. But he says, if you go to hell, if you go down to Sheol, he says, there's no planning to be done down there. There's no work to be done down there. So what is your purpose as you are working your whole life? Because if your purpose is becoming the absolute best whatever that you can be, what happens the day that you step out of this world? I look at people who change careers. And back when I was a kid, almost nobody changed careers. You were pretty much something forever. I've got some kids that I baptized that have already changed careers. They're only like 35 years old and they've already changed careers. And I mean major career changes. My best friend from high school, we graduated from high school. He was a year behind me, but he graduated and he went to college. He wanted to be an air traffic controller. That was short-lived, but now he's a nurse. Before that, he was a business guy doing computer stuff. Before that, he moved to Hollywood and he actually had his teeth done and he was going to be a star. And he actually was in like 2 or 3 of the soap operas. He was the guy in the Scrubs wheeling the gurney across the camera and not looking at the camera. Another time, he was in the background, in a filming. And after a while there, he realized he wasn't going to make it. Then he took off. But he's had 3 major career changes and a couple others that he thought about. And every time I talk to him, I'm like, so what brought all this about? And he says, well, one night I'm sitting there and he goes, I'm bored doing what I'm doing. So I decided to go and do this. So the last time he was bored, before he became a nurse, he said, I'm going to volunteer because he lives outside of Denver and it's in a place that doesn't have a full-time fire department. He says, I decided to volunteer with the volunteer fire department. And he says, I actually liked it. Oh, we didn't get very many calls, but he says, I would get out there and he says, my knowledge got stretched. And then I realized that I could learn a little bit more about this. And he says, finally one day he says, I should be a nurse. So he went to nursing school. I look at this from the perspective of now what? Because now he's almost the same age as I am. He's a year younger. He's getting ready for retirement. It's like, what are you going to do in retirement? And his words are, I don't know. Because like me, he can't sit still. And all of a sudden, Solomon says, do you understand when you get past life, you're done. And if you go to Sheol, there is nothing for you to do. And I'll be honest, for those of us, by the way, who are ADHD and a little OCD, there's nothing worse than having nothing to do. To go to a place where there's nothing to do. And you have to literally reinvent yourself. And Solomon says that's not going to happen. And so you can imagine all these people that were self-made who are so proud of all of that they had done. And all of a sudden they're in a place where nobody cares about them. Nobody knows who they are. Nobody wants to know who they are. And there's nothing they can do to change that. And you go, okay, you want a definition of hell? Sure, we can go into the whole flames and sulfur and stuff, but to be bluntly honest, sitting in a place where nobody cares about me, nobody knows who I am, nobody wants to know who I am, and I can't change anything, and yet looking up and seeing Lazarus in the bosom of Abraham, that's a pretty good definition of hell. Verse 11, again, I saw under the sun that the race is not to the swift, or the battle to the strong, or bread to the wise, or riches to the discerning, or favor to the skillful. Rather, time and chance happen to all of them. How did Solomon see these things? I mean, did he sit by the window of his palace looking out and seeing how everything? Did he walk among the people? Did he have a vision? I mean, this is all about the tortoise and the hare. This is all about the ant and the grasshopper. These are all those Aesop fables where he says, I know we want to think that if we set our mind to it, that everything's going to work. But when you realize that you go back to the 1970s when we were creating this whole new technological innovation world, so many of the people, by the way, does anybody know where Bill Gates came up with Microsoft Windows, the operating system? He actually bought it as a functioning operating system from a guy, tweaked it a little bit, presented it, got it accepted. So in other words, Bill Gates didn't write the operating system. He bought it from a guy, tweaked it a little bit, and now he's a multi-billionaire. There's a great movie out there called The Pirates of Silicon Valley. It's old, you can't find it anymore, but there's a bunch of those old movies. And a lot of these guys, there was the guy who invented the mouse. He worked for a company, and the company said, no one will ever use that thing. And they sold it off. And the person now, of course, who bought it, everybody wants a mouse. Sometimes it's not how smart you are. Sometimes it's being in the right place at the right time and having people who understand. And so Solomon says, I know what you want. I know you want to think that everything is fair, that everybody is on the same level ground, and that if you do this, this is going to happen. But he says, neither to the believer nor the unbeliever are any of these things guaranteed. Verse 12. For man certainly does not know his time, like fish caught in a cruel net, or like birds caught in a trap. So people are trapped in an evil time as it suddenly falls on them. Fish are just swimming along. All of a sudden, there's a net around them. Birds flying along, and all of a sudden, there's a net around them. We feel the same thing. Time is the ultimate enemy of those who are trying to prove something or earn something. There is never enough minutes to get everything done unless you have eternity. And that's one of the things that's beautiful about being a believer. Whatever I don't get done on earth, if it's necessary, I'll finish in heaven. I get to spend more time with those I love. The people that I always wanted to spend more time with that were taken away from me, either from death or they moved across the country or they moved around the world. I get to spend eternity with them. I get to spend time fellowshipping with individuals like Moses and Jeremiah and all the rest of these folks. And that's the only thing that we can look at and say, well, whatever I don't get done, I don't have to worry about it. It's going to work out. Verse 13, I've observed that this also is wisdom under the sun, and it's significant to me. What are the significant things in your own life? Think about it. How did you come up with them? Why are they significant? Because when we talk about significance, we determine the significance. The number of times that I've come running to someone saying, you're going to love this. And when they try it or see it or whatever, they go, it's okay. And I'm like, but this is the greatest. And they're like, not to me. Buddy of mine last night, by the way, got down to the all workers conference early, texted me at 7:00. And he said, Mitch, you always tell me to eat an In-N-Out burger. I just wanted you to know the line is around the block. And I just went back and I said, and it will be worth it. I don't know whether he's stuck in the line, but it's one of those things that there are things that sometimes we share that people enjoy. And they go, yeah, thank you for sharing that. Other times they go, not my thing. But when we talk about the significance of our life, when we talk about the events and the times in our life, I've got a young man who's now no longer very young, but he's a lot younger than I am. And the other day, I see him. He comes to Hawaii about every 3 or 4 years. I knew him back when he was in grade school. And I've met his significant other, and she's a sweetie. They both have multiple doctorates, and they travel the world working on these things. And anyway, the other day, I got a save the date. They're going to get married up in the Pacific Northwest. And I shared it with Nancy, and anyway, just pushed it off to the side because, when you're doing the save the date thing, you literally send it to the phone book. Everybody gets one. So day before yesterday on Friday, I get a Facebook message from him and a phone call from his mom who lives in Minnesota saying, did you get the save the date? Because we are really, really, really hoping you're going to be there. And I'm like, we haven't seen each other for 25 years. And she said, you were still an important part of his life, and he really would like you to be there. And all of a sudden you're like going, that's interesting, because I never made the connection between the significance that he's putting on it and the time that we had together. And that's part of what Solomon is noting. We never know how much significance we had on certain individuals and their lives because they're the ones who establish the significance, not us. We might think that we literally hung the stars and the moon for somebody and they can't even remember our name. But there's somebody else who we've completely forgotten, maybe didn't even know we impacted, and they're the ones who all of a sudden are like, if I'm getting married, or, I told you about Bob Goff, and Bob Goff has the 11 people that he wants around him when he's dying, and he bought them all jerseys, and he says, I want them around me because I know in those days they're going to encourage me, they're going to love me, and he says, I get to love them back, and he says, I want them around me when I die, and you're like going, well, that's a little morbid, but I get it. But the thing is, I assume that the 11 people that he's chosen could go one of two ways. They're either the most significant in his life, Or these are the individuals who he thinks he's that close to making the connection for them to be with Jesus. And he wants them to surround him because he wants them to see him as he dies. I don't know which it is. But you see, that's the kind of thing. What's significant? And why is it significant? Because when we walk away from this earth, we don't get a second chance. Verse 14, there was a small city with few men in it. A great king came against it, surrounded it, and built large siege works against it. Now, what do you think is so important about this city? I mean, why did this great king want this tiny little town with only a few men in it? Because what are the reasons, by the way, for conquering something? I want you to think about it. There's usually only a few. The reason you want to conquer a city is pride, anger. You start with something small so that you can say, I won. They have something that you need, and it may be something small, but if you go back to the legend of Billy Jack from the 70s movies and the 110 Soldier song, there's always somebody who thinks that they need something you have, even though it's nothing that they can actually take away from you. Verse 15, now a poor wise man was found in the city, and he delivered the city by his wisdom. Yet no one remembered that poor man. Now, why do you suppose he wasn't remembered? And what's the point of Solomon's story? So there's this tiny town, only a few men. This great king comes against it with his whole army, sets up this great siege. And yet one person with just a little bit of wisdom is able to defeat this great king and his siege works. And you look at Solomon and you say, okay, Solomon, what are you trying to say? So when Abimelech came to attack the tower, he approached its entrance to set it on fire. But a woman threw the upper portion of a millstone on Abimelech's head and fractured his skull. He quickly called his armor bearer and said to him, draw your sword and kill me, or they will say about me, a woman killed him. So his armor bearer thrust him through, and he died. And when the Israelites saw that Abimelech was dead, they all went home. Judges 9:52. This woman throws a millstone out of a window, hits the commander. He's mortally wounded, and it ends the battle. Even though, by the way, it was pretty clear if she had not done that, they would have won. Verse 16, and I said, wisdom is better than strength, but the wisdom of the poor man is despised, and his words are not heeded. Why do people value the wisdom of the rich and the powerful over the poor? I'm absolutely amazed at the number of times that I'm with somebody and we're saying, hey, where do you want to eat? And somebody pulls up Yelp and they say, hey, here's a guy in India that visited and he thinks this is a great restaurant. Okay. Hey, the last time so-and-so, a very famous person was here, they ate at this restaurant. If you've ever been to Tommy's Burgers, it's in Los Angeles. They've got a bunch of chains, but the original Tommy's, by the way, is downtown in the middle of a street that is pretty much commercial and not exactly the safest place, but Tommy's is open late in the night. And it's not uncommon to have to stand in line for over a block. And by the way, they make a hamburger and a cheeseburger, and the only real choice you get is whether you want the onions grilled on it or not. They only have chips and cans of soda and bottles of water. And by the way, if you get in line and you start trying to order something fancy, they go next and they move you right along. And this place has been around forever. Anyway, a couple of weeks ago, I had to chuckle. Bill Gates was standing in line at Tommy's, like everybody else, because you can't snap your fingers and say, do you know who I am? And this is one of those things that we're looking at. People value the wisdom, but there are things that even wisdom and riches can't get you. And this is where we find out who you really are. Jesus said, then looking up at his disciples, he said, you who are poor are blessed because the kingdom of God is yours. You're blessed. You might be poor. You're just my disciples. But you have value because the kingdom of God is yours. It's not the other way around. It's not that you were valuable, therefore the kingdom of God is yours. It's the kingdom of God is yours, now therefore you are valuable. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, you pay a tenth of mint, dill, and cumin, yet you have neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faith. These things should have been done without neglecting the others. Matthew 23. He's looking at the rich and he's saying, you guys are really good about checking the boxes, ticking off all the boxes. But he says you're missing out on the important things because you're doing the things that get you noticed. Verse 17, the calm words of the wise are to be heeded more than the shouts of a ruler over fools. When a crisis happens, how do you choose who to listen to? If you're in the midst of a crisis, whether it's somewhere where you're in the mall and all of a sudden the fire alarms go off. You're in the airport and all of a sudden, you hear somebody screaming. How do you choose who to listen to? Because there are a million voices, but only one is the one that you need to hear. Do you follow everybody who appears to know where they're going? Or do you follow those who appear to be powerful? Or do you wait until you see someone in uniform? How do you choose who to listen to and who to follow? Wisdom is better than weapons of war, but one sinner can destroy much good. Joshua 6 in the story of Achan's sin that troubled the entire nations. Now, the way that this happened was Joshua's out. They are conquering the land, finally, the promised land. They're going to make it their own. God is fulfilling his promise. And God says, everything is to be destroyed. This is not about pillaging. This is not about making people rich. Everything is to be destroyed. And Achan found a bunch of stuff that was really pretty and shiny. And so he kept it for himself. And the nation was being torn apart. God was punishing it. And finally, Joshua said, all right, everybody line up. Who's responsible for this? And Achan, to his credit, steps forward and says, yeah, I know God said not to do it, but it was just so pretty. God then was able to fix everything. Achan is put to death. And he says, all right, now go and destroy the stuff that Achan stole. All of this, he says, needs to be put back into balance. And this is one of those things where even one individual can bring a tremendous amount of pain and hurt on an entire nation. And this is where when we see this, we have to make sure we know where we're going, how we're getting there, what are the signs of us getting there, who we can trust and who we can't. Solomon, this whole chapter has been about the back and forth. Everybody's looking to make their way. The question is, who are they following? Why are they doing what they're doing? What do they expect the end result to be? And how do they think that this is all going to work out? In the hands of God or in their own? All right, go in peace, serve the Lord in gladness. Next week, we will get through, I hope, almost all of chapter 10. And then we only have one more chapter left. So we should just have a couple more weeks. And then about halfway through, we'll probably do a special Advent study for a couple of weeks.